Treasury officials and the viewers at large. Thank you so much once again for joining us at this post-supplementary budget press briefing tabled by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. On the panel today, we've got the Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. He will be joined by the Deputy Minister David Masondo, together with the Director General of the National Treasury, Dondo Mokgajane. Then we also have SARS Commissioner Mr. Edward Kisvetter. The Governor of the South African Reserve Bank, Lesitja Kganyago, also joins us this afternoon, but he will join us virtually, so he's not with us in the room. So I'd like to open the lines right now and the WhatsApp line to journalists to proceed with their questions that they might have following the supplementary budget that was tabled by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni a little earlier on. So my colleague Nongleba is on the WhatsApp line. She will be feeding through all those questions to me, so colleagues can start feeding those questions to me. And in the telephone line, we've got Ishmael, who will be manning all your telephone calls. So how we're going to proceed with this press briefing is that we will take 5 questions at a time to allow colleagues to give us or to pose their questions to the panel that we've got today. And we do ask colleagues in the media that it should be 1 question per news organization in order not to clog the line and allow other media houses to get sufficient time in terms of asking or posing their questions. So I'll cross over now to Nongleba to pose a few questions. So it's 5 questions at a time, and then we'll get the panel to ask, and then we'll take another round of questions. Nongleba, do we have anyone on the WhatsApp line at the moment?
Yes, Mashudu. The first question is from Dennis Webster from Newframe. The question is, both the President and the Minister initially committed 50 billion to social grants. This has been cut to just over 40 billion. Why is that, and where have those funds been reallocated? How much of the funds allocated to social grants will go towards the special COVID grant? Dennis is also asking how much of the 500 billion committed by the President has been spent so far. Heidi Jokos from ENCA is asking,
You can proceed. We have a bit of a feedback coming through. Sorry, colleagues. I think we've got that. Oh, it's the Governor. I'll just quickly mute him here, and then I'll unmute him once he answers the questions. You can proceed, Nongleba. Apologies for that.
okay. Heidi Jokos from ENCA is asking, can the Minister please be specific about the SOEs that will be part of the rationalization process? What do you mean by incorporating certain functions into government linked to the SOE part of the budget? Tando Mayeko from Melingodi is asking, South Africa intends to borrow 4.2 billion US dollars through the IMF's rapid financing instrument. How far are these negotiations? When can the public expect the loan to be approved, and what are some of the conditionalities that were discussed so far? Then we have 2 questions that are interrelated. One is from Monique from Bloomberg, and the other one is from Angelo from CGTN. What is the process with the IMF and other multilateral institutions, and how will the foreign loans, like the new BRICS Bank, be ring-fenced and accounted for?
Yeah, I think we'll pause there for so that the panel can answer. Minister.
Oh, thank you very much. I'll just deal with maybe 1 or so questions and hand over the rest to my colleagues. We announced that we would go on a global resource mobilization. And that global resource mobilization has involved the following: the New Development Bank, the IMF, the World Bank, and the African Development Bank. I might have jumped one other. So far, only the New Development Bank has decided to lend us $1 billion US, which is equivalent to plus minus 18 billion rand, depending on the day. So that's a new development bank. The IMF and the National Treasury have been involved in quite a protracted negotiations process. That's where we are planning to source 4.2 billion US dollars. The discussions are tough, they're difficult, and we think that we might have come to some common understanding. And on the basis of that, the staff at the IMF will approach their executive board early in July to make their submission on South Africa's request. Once they have agreed to accede to our request, we think that the World Bank will follow suit. And of course, we'll then proceed with the others, the African Development Bank and so on. But I want to emphasize that, as I said in the speech, this is not revenue. This is borrowings, which means that have to be repaid at some point with the requisite interest. So it's very important that ideally, in an ideal economic environment, these sorts of loans that one acquires internationally, it really should be used for investment and not just to deal with the things that we have to deal with now. But we're in a crisis, and therefore we have to respond in the manner in which we are responding. Now, and this is important because what we're trying to present is a very difficult financial situation. And this, again, is a supplementary budget. It's not the February budget. It's a supplementary budget occasioned by the changed circumstances that we find ourselves. So I think that that's a question I will take, and then my colleagues will take. Eh? Oh, you didn't hear me? Sincere apologies about that. But I think I've answered nevertheless, and I think DG can deal with the others and the Deputy Minister. Yeah.
Thank you very much. There was a question on the 50 billion rand and why is it less? What we are saying in the speech, and Minister was very clear that government is committed to the 500 billion rand package that was announced by the President. However, from a spending point of view, we're watching very closely the take-up. We're watching very closely the use of the resources. What we have picked up and what we are picking up is that the intake of the special grant is slow. And then what we are then doing, we provide best estimates. And that's why we then reduce the allocation. It doesn't mean the commitment is not there to actually reach the target. It is there. When people come through, we will obviously pay as required, because this is an intervention that government committed to, and it's an intervention that government wants to actually ensure that we meet the commitment. There's also a question about SOCs, which ones will be rationalized. I think this is an ongoing. What we are saying in the speech and in the book is that we are embarking on expenditure reviews, which will ultimately be a stepping stone towards the zero-based budget that we've been talking about. Departments and different departments in governments have been engaged to identify those entities that are not needed, those entities that needs to be meshed with departments, those entities that, for instance, will need to be, that should cease to exist based on need and priority. So we'll be very clear, and I guess as we approach the medium-term budget policy statement, as we indicated, will be more detailed in terms of exactly which ones will be closed, which ones will be supported further, and which ones will be matched within as programs in various departments. In terms of the spending to date, because we have not, for the purpose of how we budgeted, the Minister was very clear in terms of saying that this money is not, revenue. It is borrowing. We are actually indicating and calculating it as part of the total borrowing requirements for this year. So as a result, what we are clear about is that the money that we're putting aside is towards specific COVID interventions, as identified in the book, with the specific interventions that we indicated. So at this point in time, we are not able to actually single out the actual spending per category, but what we are able to do, we are accounting for those in the normal way that government actually accounts. On the 22nd of every month, we get what we call IYMs, in-year monitoring reports, that comes through from various departments, and we are able to track and indicate where exactly money is being spent, because this money is part of government programs. And this is ongoing, and what we are committing in the book and what we committed in the speech, that will enhance the monitoring and that we actually will be placing on the spending related, COVID-related spending, and ensure that this money is spent accordingly. I think that was about all the questions that were asked, Amashudi. Thank you.
Yes. I think we can move to another round of questions.
As people ask further questions, I really like to draw your attention to the centerpiece of what we're trying to do here, the revised fiscal framework. That's the issue. That's the meat of the beast. I think I just want to draw people's attentions back there. The fact that we are having to submit a supplementary budget because the situation has changed. So we don't get drawn into SAA, into these other things. The only thing that really I talked about here is the land bank. But let's come back to the real substance of the matter. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Minister. Nonglaba, do we have more? Oh, let me start off with the telephoners just to find out whether we've got anyone on the telephone line.
Thanks, Chairperson. On the line at the moment, we have one question from Ray Matlaka, Daily Maverick. You can go ahead, Ray.
Hi, Minister. Can you please elaborate on what you mean by finding a balanced solution that sets compensation at a fair level when it comes to public sector wages? Does this mean that the government will stick to the terms of the 2018 wage agreement? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. I think Nonglaba, we can take another 4 questions.
Maya Fisher-French is asking, has there been any indication on allowing retirement fund members to access a portion of their pension for their hardships needs? Dadi Patel from the Wall Street Journal is asking, where will the 7 billion for international financial institutions come from? Peter Detroit, which is linked to the question that was asked on the telephone line from News24, is asking, in February you said you were much more bullish about reining in on the public sector wage bill. This time around you delegate the matter to the Minister of Public Service and Administration. Have your targets changed? And the last one is from Yane Delanga from Rapport, which is also linked, which is saying, in February you said $186 billion rands saved in the public sector wage bill will be announced in 2 years. Is that target still intact? Has those savings been consumed by increased spending in the public health budget? I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Nonglaba. I'll put it to the panel.
That's quite a mouthful. I'm sure all are aware that there's work being done in the Public Service Coordinating Bargaining Council, where the lead ministry or lead minister there is the Minister of Public Service and Administration. So I'm not just kicking for touch when I say he's leading the process. Indeed, he is leading the process. And some of the unions, I think, have taken him to court, to the labor court, whilst others have remained in the arbitration process. That's why I say I wish him well. Our overall objective is for a compensation system that's fair, that is transparent, that is fiscally affordable. And it is within that kind of framework that we hope that the minister will be able to lead the process. So I'm not kicking for touch. And the $7 billion story, I thought I explained it. But I said the New Development Bank, then I said IMF, and I said the World Bank, and then the African Development Bank. That's what I spoke about, and those are the areas we're looking at. But any gifts are welcome.
Yeah, just to reinforce what am I audible? What the minister has just presented now. The public debt, it was a problem when the minister presented the budget in February. It was 3.5 trillion. It has increased now to almost 4 trillion. So all those problems that we've identified, which has put us to where we are in terms of the causes or the drivers of the public debt, those problems did not disappear because there was a COVID. In fact, they've worsened. And what we try to do through this adjustment is to highlight the extent of the problems, but also what we're basically doing to deal with those problems. The first area in trying to deal with this public debt is to try to balance, to deal with the budget deficit, which has grown. And it has grown because our expenditure has largely been on SOEs, wage bill, and other wasteful expenditure in the government system as a whole. So those drivers of our public debt have not disappeared because there was COVID. They are still there. And that's why the minister is also indicating that the discussions with the labor movement are ongoing, and there's a court process which he just alluded to. And the other area around which, or the mechanism through which we are dealing with the public debt, it's to look at our assets and liabilities, which I'm afraid it has become liabilities and liabilities, because many of our SOEs they are increasingly becoming serious liabilities on government, and then I must add here that there is a presidential state-owned enterprise council which the president is appointed, and we will be working with them to have clear conversations on which SOEs should government still participate, and if it does participate, in which way, and not just at a national level, but also at provincial level, at municipal level, because there are a lot of small entities in provinces, in municipalities that we need to look at and ask hard questions about whether they are growth enhancing or they are just a burden to the fiscals. And another area through which we're trying to address this debt, not just debt, but also unemployment. I mean, 10 million people are unemployed. It's like a population of Zimbabwe. The Quota Labor Survey, which were announced yesterday, and we've not, the states SA, they've not factored in the impact of COVID. So we've got a huge challenge insofar, or not just the public debt, but also the unemployment. And the minister has indicated that we're still committed to dealing with the structural reforms, just to make sure that our economy grows, so that there are other alternatives to employment. People don't rely just on social grants, but we should be in a position to absorb a lot of people into the economy. The minister again has also laid out that we committed to rebuilding the economy by focusing on infrastructure. So all these issues, so all I'm saying in short is that COVID has just worsened all the problems that we've articulated in February, and we've put forward before the nation what we're intending to do with this problem, and we've highlighted very clearly where we are insofar as debt, because debt is a problem. It shifts our expenditure from infrastructure, from the thing that we should be doing, to paying our lenders. Like I said, in February, we indicated that we're spending almost 230 billion rand, and it has increased because our debt, it keeps on increasing. Thank you, Minister.
There was a question on the withdrawal from the retirement funds. I think, look, it's important that we be careful in considering something like that. Because as a country, we don't save enough. And obviously, our preservation is very, very poor. So we'll also need to change some legislation, and it's not going to be an easy process. So we must be also careful. Through NETLEC, and Labour has raised this in particular, and we are engaging. So it's important that we look at the pros and cons jointly, and also look at the logistics, so that we don't, in trying to fix, we don't actually create more challenges when people obviously will be more impacted in future years. So this is one point that I think we're engaging, and we need to actually make sure that we don't as I say, disadvantage our own futures insofar as this is concerned. So it's something that we look at and engage Labour in the NETLEC process. The Minister did answer the question. I think that was it, Mashudu, in terms of
Yes.
the wage.
Thank you very much, DG. I think we'll take another round of questions. We'll start with Union Labour.
Thank you, Mashudu. Miriam Issa from Finweek is asking, Minister, in the supplementary budget documents, there's Claire from indicates no new money to SAA. How does this fit with the Department of Public Enterprises stated aim of rescuing the airline? Will any rescue of SAA have to rely exclusively on private funds apart from money set aside in the February budget? Can I just have one last one? Mashudu? Can I go?
Yes, you can go.
And skills to take this approach.
Over to you, Minister.
Yes, there's a bit of an undertone in the last part of that question that government is made up of fools, which is not true. Many highly competent people in the government system. Will we be able to cope with a zero budgeting system? The answer is yes. We've been dealing with a far more complex medium-term expenditure framework system for a number of years, and the staff in the treasury system, both national and provincial and so on, can write books and books about this. So is there capacity and capability? Yes, there is. The important thing, though, is that with the zero-based budgeting system, we bring the interaction between the technocrats and the politicians early on in the process, so that there's a conversation about what are the priorities that the political leadership would like to achieve in the short and medium term. So let me give you an example. So political leadership has a discussion and say that we have a manifesto which was the one that was used to encourage people to vote for us. And therefore, as political leadership, we have a responsibility to prioritize those things which are in our manifesto, because that's what we went to the people and said we wanted to do. Following things: complete the N2 bridge to allow flow of traffic. Okay? So is that the first priority? If we agree, yes, it is. Then put it the number one, then you cost it. And then you go number two, land bank must not fail because it's so critical to the whole land and agricultural system in South Africa. Number two, therefore, you cost it so much, and so on. This does not mean that previously there was no priorities. It doesn't mean that. Of course there were priorities. But you're starting from scratch this time. You're not saying that, what is the baseline from which you start? You start from zero. That will be seen in many case studies, which I have read, has resulted in a lot of unearthing of things which are not necessary, which have become just traditional spending items. And the priorities then come out much more clearer. So I think that's what people are trying to do. We did not seek to introduce a supplementary budget to take over the functions of the Department of Public Enterprises. And therefore the questions of what Deputy DG, who said where, is something that I think you should direct at them. Let them answer that question so that we don't get into things we know nothing about. In this supplementary budget, we make specific reference to the land bank. And so that's where we come from. What other question was there?
There was one on tax. On the tax.
Tax, the Caesar is here, you can answer.
Thank you. I think first of all, on tax policy, the Minister had already indicated in the February budget speech that his intention was, in fact, to focus on broadening the tax base as opposed to adjusting the rates, because we had felt that from a tax rate perspective, we had reached a point of inflection where raising rates does not necessarily extract more revenue. Clearly, from a COVID perspective, one has to look at where are the opportunities, and that will be a function of the work of the Minister and Treasury over the next number of months. I do think, however, what's important is that it is not as if from a tax compliance perspective we are a fully compliant society. And so what we have as SARS is our work is cut out in a number of ways. We have seen general tax compliance levels slipping, whether that is companies who ought to register who don't register, companies who should submit and file declarations who don't, a big focus on employers who collect pay as you earn and don't hand it over to SARS. So there's a lot of areas of non-compliance that we will be focusing on and have begun to focus in fact. The second point is there are still organizations involved in aggressive tax arrangements, and so you will recall that we have now established a unit to focus specifically on wealthy and complex tax arrangements of individuals who are so-called super rich and high net worth individuals, and that will be a big focus alongside the work of having re-established the large business center. In the large business, we have to amplify our focus, especially on international taxes, where we still find significant non-compliance in areas such as transfer pricing, as well as base erosion and profit shifting schemes, and that work will slowly gain momentum. In the criminal activities, we will focus significantly on areas of syndicated fraud. We have seen a proliferation, and sadly, even during this time of the COVID challenge, criminals take their chances. COVID does not make you who you are, it simply reveals who you are. So if you were a thief going into COVID, you are just a better thief looking for better opportunities. And so syndicated fraud, especially in the VAT area, is an area we will focus on, as well as deliberate misdeclaration of import values, where importers go into complicit arrangements with exporters from countries, particularly such as China and India, and deliberately seek to defraud the fiscus by misstating import values. And then two general points, I think, for us is to expand and increase the use of data so that we can improve early detection through artificial intelligence, as well as a greater focus on the collection of outstanding debt. We have seen the debt book, that is debt that is not disputed owed by many taxpayers, that is not recovered, and so an additional focus just to make sure that the debt that is in fact due to the fiscus is collected. So these are the 5 areas where we will amplify our focus to make sure that at least even in the trying times of COVID, we must ensure more than ever before that the revenue that is due to the fiscus is in fact collected. And so there are clear areas and clear opportunities where we will be focusing our attention on in the coming year.
I think there was just one last question on the 100 billion on infrastructure over the next 10 years.
Yeah, there's two, just to add on the commissioner. From a tax administration point of view, obviously the 5 key important elements are critical. But from a policy point of view, and that's where Miriam's question is coming from, Miriam said we have put in 40 billion in the outer year. Yes, I think you did exactly that. And as you know, Miriam, tax policy discussions only take place in February, and not in October, nor in the supplementary budget. So we will give the economy now to breathe, in terms of not burdening the economy any further, but we will definitely in February make pronouncements insofar as this 40 billion rand is concerned. The 100 billion rand infrastructure is there, and I can confirm that at any given point in time, if an opportunity or a fiscal space emerges in this in future budgets, we will definitely, based on the discussions yesterday, the symposium yesterday with the president leading the discussions, we will have to make resources more available to ensure that infrastructure remain the catalyst of growth that we wanted it to be, and we have to then reposition infrastructure. An infrastructure that will definitely lead to ensuring that productive sectors of the economy flourish in a way that we want to. So yeah, the 100 billion is there, and we have penciled it in. The infrastructure fund will be up and running. We have had various engagements with Dr. Ramakgopa in the presidency, and with the DBSA as going to have to play a very critical role. We will stand behind and be ready to fund, and not only to fund in some cases, but to offer any form of guarantees that are needed in order to actually ensure that these proactive sectors of the economy flourish to a point where we want them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, DG. Ishmael, do we perhaps have a question on the telephone lines?
No questions on the lines. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nongeba?
Thank you, Mashudu. Just also a reminder about the questions on SAA that were asked in the previous round.
No, Minister asked that we move those to the DP, yeah.
Lamiz Omachi from Fin24. In terms of the reform agenda, how much of it will have to change given the impact of COVID-19? Vikas Burger from that agenda is asking, how will government help the agriculture sector with the crucial role they have to play with regards to food security and job creation, keeping in mind the challenging times we are currently experiencing? John Fraser from ZA Confidential is asking, when will we see details of spending cuts within government departments? And Llewellyn Prince from Nadvar Firandundach. The ANC and its alliance partners had previously rejected any suggestion that South Africa may turn to the IMF and the IMF for loans, as it may subordinate the country's sovereignty to the dictates of these institutions. Today, the minister announced that South Africa will borrow $7 billion from international institutions. Was there a compromise reached with the ANC and its alliance partners about this? Elena from CNN is asking, what are the probabilities of a sovereign debt crisis based on the current debt trajectory? What percentages are we looking at here? The same person is also asking, there is still a funding gap of about 300 billion rand between the funding requirement and bond issuance. $7 billion from international financial institutions equate to 120 billion rand. Where will the rest of the money be raised from? And the third question from...
I think maybe we should pause there for a little bit, yeah. Thank you. Let's take the floor, Minister.
The issue about the International Monetary Fund, it's an important one. It's an important one. But the amounts we're talking about are very small in comparison with the other borrowings that we undertake. As I mentioned, we have been in conversations with the International Monetary Fund, and we think we've reached a point where we've found each other, I think. I think so, such that the staff of the IMF is able to approach the executive board of the IMF in early July. So that tells a story. That tells a story that there's no way in which I would have proceeded to reach this level of conversations with the IMF if the ANC leadership did not support this. So the truth of the matter is that the ANC leadership supports this position, that we approach the IMF and the World Bank and the New Development Bank, and that the critical issue is that as we enter into these borrowing arrangements with the IMF, that nothing is done that undermines national sovereignty. I don't know why people think by definition we are so careless that would do anything to undermine national sovereignty. We're just so unsmart. We're not going to do anything of the sort. But anybody who has ever negotiated with a lender will know that there's no lender who just throws money at you. If I have to lend you money, I need to be sure that you're going to return my money. And therefore you have to give commitments about when are you going to return this money. That's why you enter into these long negotiations processes. Very tedious, at times very irritating. But one has to do that. That's why we are in these positions to do what needs to be done in the interest of the country. So that's about the IMF and the World Bank. But you know, the National Treasury every year has an international borrowing program. I don't know why people don't look into that. There's a borrowing program where you have to issue global bonds. This happens every year. Why is anybody asking questions about this? I think the last bond issue we did was a $5 billion bond issue. Am I correct, did you?
It was
4.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
We're
which is-
looking for 3.
It's
We got
5.
5.
Confirmation, it's 5.
You ended up with 5.
Yeah.
That's more than what we're going to the IMF for. But people don't ask, maybe because we don't explain it, because this will be a bonds that were raised with the participation of people like Fidelity, BlackRock, if they participated, and others, JP Morgan Asset Management, and so on. So maybe there is a general question about whether we should borrow at all. That's a discussion for another day. I would like to be in a position where I don't have to go and borrow anything. It's the same like any other individual. They would rather not go to their bank for an overdraft or to borrow, but life is such that, I mean, when you've got that hippo mouth as wide open as it is, you have to find a way to close the funding gap. So that's the situation. So, but the critical issue, I think, that we confront, that's why we have had to have this supplementary budget, is that the economic situation has changed from the way it was in February. The fiscal framework has been put under stress. Those are the critical things. So what's happening to the consolidated budget deficit? We've indicated is risen now to about 15.7% of GDP. That's an important number. The budget deficit, which has also risen to about 14% and above. Now, the debt service costs, which we thought would be around 65% of GDP in February, now rising to over 80%. Now, these are the critical issues that the supplementary budget must focus on, so that all these other numbers have to assist in bringing back fiscal credibility, such that we don't have a situation where by 2023-24, the debt to GDP ratio is greater than the GDP of the country, and thereby triggering one form of a sovereign debt crisis or another. I think those are the key things. So you'll see in the supplementary budget that we have moved quite a substantial amount of funds either within departments or between departments. And certain programs that we know, for example, are very slow in spending, we might have to think twice about them. And we have sufficient experience now to know that there have been many cases of fiscal dumping. So we know about that. So I want us to come back and focus on the supplementary budget, its core fiscal framework, and what is it that we're trying to do in order to address the COVID situation, where we're shifting funding quite significantly towards the COVID struggle, and therefore it becomes unavoidable that if there are domestic and international institutions which have COVID-related funding, that we approach those and we deal with the situation. Now, there's something that disappeared from the speech, Roy. I don't know where Roy is.
He's up there.
There's something that disappeared. What happened to Regulation 28? No, he's shaking his head. Oh, sorry. This other fellow there says, okay, I'm not saying anything there. But it was in the speech until last night. You made me memorize it and then you removed it. That's so unfair. I mean, I had to go and reread about this regulation in detail.
We decided we will ease it in properly.
Okay.
But you know, page 30 of the budget, supplementary budget review is very clear. Figure 1, 4.1 and figure 4.2. Figure 4.1 shows that hippopotamus mouth widening. And just to echo the, I'm answering the question on the sovereign debt crisis. We went to cabinet and cabinet gave us the go ahead. We had two options. Either we go with the passive scenario or the active scenario. In the passive scenario, that's when we will be talking about the sovereign debt crisis. Because in 23-24, this debt to GDP was going to hit 106%. And that means we would have been in trouble. So the passive scenario was not good for South Africa, it's bad for South Africa. Because in there you had unsustainable debt levels, you had expenditures that's hitting the roof, you will not be able to manage our public finances. But with the active scenario, that's where debt stabilized at 87%. 87.4% in 23-24. And that's where we become responsible public finance managers to ensure that we approach the burden that we want to place on future generations and approach that very carefully. Whilst doing that, reining in expenditure and closing the mouth of this hippopotamus. There's another question in terms of the financing of the gross borrowing requirement. You are correct. I don't know who asked the question about the 400 billion rand. In February, we said, at 344, and now that is about 776 billion, 400 billion rand difference. That tells you, with the under collection from the tax revenues in 1 year of 300 plus billion, it tells you we have a challenge. So if we don't approach the management of the public finance in a responsible way, we are going to be in trouble. Now, as part of the financing strategy that the ALMT people under Tsepiso's guidance bring to us and approve, and we, the three of us, approve that, in there, the funding strategy will recognize various institutions, domestic and foreign borrowing requirements. We had to revise that this time around, and the strategy. And in page 35 and 36, and I'm directing to these pages because they are quite important for you to understand that we had remodeled our funding approach, whereby we'll use sterilization deposits in the Reserve Bank as part of a temporary relief that we are bringing in, and obviously approaching and approaching how to refinance that moving forward. So I will appeal to the person who asked the question to specifically get page 35 and 36 of the supplementary budget review to understand that we are aware of the challenge that we have, and we are approaching this very carefully and very clearly, including the fact that not only are we using sterilization deposits, but we're also approaching these IFIs and try and get the $7.5 billion. So as part of our strategy this time around, it obviously will change in future based on our need and our requirements. So I think that's very clear, and we want some of the colleagues to look at that. And this book, by the way, becomes now the reference point between now and October in terms of any question that South Africans or anybody out there may have as to what are we doing with the supplementary budget. We are approaching very responsibly. We are recognizing that tax revenues have declined significantly. We are recognizing the economy has not been performing. We are recognizing that COVID and the implications only, and not only COVID, by the way, let me remind everyone that the downgrade itself had its own challenges by Moody's. So all of this as a package of challenges, we are putting a package of responses together. And we know, obviously in 3 to 4 months now, we'll obviously go to the medium-term budget policy statement in October and review some of the things and actually ensure that we're building this bridge towards what essentially should be a very, very tough budget of 2021 that actually will position us or reposition South Africa to a higher growth trajectory. Thank you.
Thank you, DG. I think there was also a question on the details of the spending cuts. When can we expect that, as well as the agricultural sector in terms of the food security?
With the support for Land Bank, for instance, this was one of the prime reasons why we thought we cannot, and we've been saying it, we cannot Land Bank to collapse, and that's why we have engaged with lenders, note holders, we have engaged with the bank board, the Land Bank board, and finally Cabinet then gave approval to support Land Bank to the tune of 3 billion rand, recognizing the important role that it plays in food security. Now, the details of the cuts, let's not look at them as cuts. Look at them as reprioritization areas. In this day and time in our history, how do we reposition expenditure to a point where we can get productive sectors of the economy to move? If we look at it like that, we are not negatively going to see this as cuts, because cuts in them are negative. Cuts brings resentment. But essentially, we all know that there are programs in government that needs to be stopped, that are not relevant for this time in our history, that will not take us out of the quagmire that we're in. So let's reposition that and reprioritize. And that's why we said zero-based budgeting is going to be an approach that we're going to be using forward, whereby we look at all spending areas, we look at all allocations from a zero base, and then decide based on new realities that we are faced with. The new realities are as follows. The COVID implications. We will need to boost the tourism sector, clearly. We will need to boost the agricultural sector in a big way. We will need to build infrastructure from scratch. We will need to have to make sure that SARS is able to reposition itself in collecting more taxes, because in this period, with the capacity that SARS has lost, we also picked up that tax avoidance has increased. So we have to make sure that we play a much bigger role and support SARS and many other interventions, whether you look at the transport sector, rail, ports, all the items that were mentioned in the infrastructure space symposium yesterday. So we will have to reposition these spending areas in those areas and that will actually lead us to growth. And the last point, we are not forgetting the growth paper that was it started as a so-called Tito paper, treasury paper, and finally it became a government paper that's backed by cabinet. In that paper, towards an economic growth strategy for South Africa, in there are elements that remain relevant and key in terms of taking our structural reform agenda process forward. And between now and February, we really need to accelerate. And that's why I think it re-emphasizes the point that the minister made, that the deputy minister is going to lead this area of work in the Vulindlela office within the ministry that actually looks at this, how to unlock certain areas, whether it's departmental engagements, whether it's sector engagements, whether it's private sector, etc. That because this ultimately is the solution for South Africa. Borrowing more is not the solution. Cutting more is not the solution. The solution lies in us growing the economy and ensuring that our growth agenda is enhanced. So that's the solution. Growing the economy of South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, DG.
You know what, DG? I've just discovered something. I discovered something because some of the questions arise because we didn't have the lockup session. We didn't have the lockup session.
Yes, we
For
did.
example, if we had been in the lockup section, people would have been familiar with the detail that is there from page 49 going on. So unfortunately, I think the situation put us in this. So people are asking questions which, had we done the lockup in the morning, they would probably have had those questions answered. So it's quite unfortunate. But I strongly recommend that people spend a bit of time going through the document, and you'll see all those reallocations and so on. And then there's explanatory detail inside there. I think if needs be, probably in 2 weeks or so, DG's team could, there's not a picture they're going to bring out with this thing. I know them by now. Maybe DG's team in about 2 weeks or so, you can go again into detail when people have had time to study the document. It's on the website, then people can familiarize themselves. It's just the inconvenience of this COVID situation. But because I could pick up from some of the questions that people haven't had the opportunity really to go through the documentation. But really, I haven't had much sleep.
Sorry about that.
So
We're calling it a day.
Permission to depart.
Yeah, we're calling it a day. Thank you very much, Minister Tito Mboweni, for joining us this afternoon. So we have come to the end of our post-supplementary budget media briefing. Thank you so much to members of the media, the National Treasury officials and the viewers at home. And I'd also like to thank the panel today, which was Finance Minister Tito Mboweni, the Deputy Minister of Deputy Minister of Finance, Mr. David Masondo, the Director General of the National Dr. Principal. We also had the Director General of the National Treasury, Dondo. I almost say doctor, but we'll honor that. Dondo Mokajani, and we were joined by the Governor of the South African Reserve Bank, Lisicha Kganyago, virtually, as well as SARS Commissioner, Mr. Edward Kisvetas. Thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen, and thank you to everybody. Good night.